My name is Frank Heile. I've got physics degrees, and then I worked as a software engineer, and then I retired in the year 2000, and since then I've been kind of working on this idea about spirituality and a model of consciousness that explains spirituality. And I'm writing a book, and the title of the book would be Spirituality Explained. And this is going to be some of the key ideas of that book. And everything I talk about is going to be completely compatible with the currently known theories of physics and science. And there are no spirits in this explanation of spirituality. So the first question is, what is spirituality? Well, I have an equation for that. Spirituality equals religion minus dogma. So an example of dogma would be a religion that says this book here is the truth, and any other book that you find is a heresy, and it's not the truth. So that you have to take that kind of a dogma out of the religion to get spirituality. And spiritual paths can either be theistic or non-theistic. An example of a theistic path would be like Christianity. A non-theistic path would be Buddhism. And on the theistic paths, any dogma that they have about the God has to also be taken out. So if they're saying that God is exactly like this and did exactly this action, that's part of dogma that would be taken out of the religion to get you what the spiritual path is really about. Spirituality cultivates a number of different positive values, and I've got a list of some of them here. And there are also a number of different spiritual practices, which include prayer, meditation, and surrendering to a higher power of some kind. And this model of spirituality will explain both theistic and non-theistic spiritual paths and the positive values they cultivate. For theistic paths, they'll explain why and how the God concept arose and why and how spiritual practices work. Now, my hypothesis is that spirituality started about 50,000 years ago when human consciousness changed. The evidence for this change in human consciousness comes from behavioral modernity. And that's a pattern of multiple kinds of changes in our behavior from the way the humans were previously to about 50,000 years ago. All of these behaviors were well entrenched at that point in time. And this was a relatively rapid transition. For example, the last common ancestor with the other great apes was about 6 million years ago. And about 3 million years ago, humans started using primitive stone tools. About 1 million years ago, we were able to control fire. And finally, about 200,000 years ago, we were anatomically modern. In fact, we had a slightly bigger brain than a modern human has. So the question is, what happened between 200,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago? Why did it take so long for that to develop? My hypothesis is that it was the development of a complete language model of the world that allowed behavioral modernity to happen. So the idea is that once they were able to keep increasing their vocabulary over that whole 3 million year period, say from the first stone tools till 50,000 years ago, the vocabulary gradually increased, and it finally got to the point where they could actually describe the entire world in words. And that's when the technology really took off and allowed them to do all those kinds of new behaviors. And this language world model not only gave us all of that great technology, but it also caused a living problem, and spirituality is the cure for that problem. Now I'm going to be talking about agents, and you can consider a definition of an agent to say that an agent has goals, it has a way of sensing the world, and it has a way of making changes to the world to achieve its goals. So therefore, a human can be considered to be an agent because we have goals and we can change the world. So we're a human agent. Now, there's a theorem from control theory back in 1970 that says that every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. I'm going to call this the good regulator theorem, and I'm going to refer to it previously. Previously, people thought, well, you could have a model of the system inside of your regulator, but it wasn't necessary. This theorem proved that it's necessary. And this means that any good agent must have a model of its world that it's trying to control. So, in fact, the theorem actually goes further than that. It says it must be a model of the world. And what that means is there's a one-to-one mapping between states of the system and states of the regulator. So there's a one-to-one mapping between the states of my brain here and the states of the world out there. That's what it means to have a representation of the world. Now, in addition, if the agent is part of the world that it's trying to make changes in, then the agent must have a model of itself, and I call that a self-model. So that's required because I'm actually taking up space in the world here. So I have to account for my body being in this world if I'm going to make changes in this world. So that's a self-model. Now the question is, where do humans live? We have a human living in a world, and then we have a human self-model living in a model of the world. Where are we in all that? So to answer that question, let's look at what a self-model for a human might be. It would certainly have a body model. It's a model of where my arms and legs are right now, where my body is in relation to the other objects in this room. That's part of my self-model. But it also includes an autobiographical self-model. For example, hi, my name is Frank Heile. I have a PhD. I have a daughter and a wife, and I'm writing a book on spirituality. So that's part of my autobiographical self-model. And obviously that could go on for a long way to describe my complete past and what I plan to do in the future. Now, the body in the world compared to the model of the body in the model of the world doesn't really help you answer this question of where do we live. However, we also have the autobiographical self-model. That's part of the self-model that humans have. And that autobiographical self-model is a purely conceptual model. Those words, Frank, PhD, wife, daughter, those kinds of things, they are concepts that live in the language model of the world. They're not out there in the physical world. So concepts do not exist in the physical world. So our autobiographical self-model can only exist in our language model of the world. It does not exist in the real world. Therefore, we live in a model of the world. Now, another question to ask is, do we experience the world directly, or do we experience our model of the world? So that's the question here. Do we only experience our model of the world? Well, colors can help you answer that question. The way colors work is that there are three kinds of receptors in our eyes that can receive light in either red, green, or blue. And it's those three receptors, each set of receptors by themselves essentially gives you a black and white image of what the world would look like if it was only illuminated by red light or green light or blue light. So for example, if the world was illuminated by red light and you took a black and white image of it, you would see something like that. If it was illuminated by blue light, you would see that. And if it was illuminated by green light, you'd see that. So these three black and white images are the information that goes from our eye to our brain. And yet our brain takes those three boring black and white images and gives you this. Those colors that are in that image there don't exist in the world. They exist in our model of the world, and that's the only place that they exist. Evolution found it advantageous to do this because it helped us pick out ripe fruits and be able to distinguish things more easily than trying to look at the three different gray values for that same point here. So this was created by our brain, and that's where we live. We live in the model of the world, and we experience the model of the world. So we are not just a body living in a world. We are a self-model living in a model of the world, and our sensory experiences are of that model of the world. We do not directly experience the real world. Okay, so the main hypothesis of my explanation is that there are three different but interconnected agents that make up the human agent. So the human agent as a whole is one agent, but you can in engineering, you frequently take an agent and break it up into multiple agents that are going to work together to produce the effect that one agent should have. Now, we don't know for sure that evolution followed that same kind of an engineering diagram, but we have evidence that it did. So I'll present that evidence. So we have three agents, whereas animals only have two agents, and the third agent is very limited in animals compared to humans. And the God concept can be found in one of the two agents of the animals. The human living problem was caused by the now very effective third agent that we have that animals don't have. So the three agents are the thinker. The thinker is the executive function of the brain, and it uses language, symbols, concepts, and images to solve problems. It's the problem solver. The doer controls the body and also generates emotions and feelings. And the experiencer constructs both the sensory and language or conceptual model of the world and of the body. So the existence of the experiencer is required by that good regulator theorem. You have to have a model of the world, and that's what the experiencer does. It creates that model of the world that both the thinker and doer use. So the thinker and doer are two agents that use the model of the world created by the experiencer. Now, what's the evidence that we have a thinker and a doer instead of just one agent there? Well, the most compelling evidence for that comes from dual process theory in psychology. Dual process theory says that there are two different systems, and what I'm doing is I'm renaming the fast subconscious system that they found, I'm calling that the doer, and the slow conscious system is the thinker. Now I'm going to talk about dual process theory. First of all, it was popularized by Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. And the main thing he talked about in that book are the biases that system one, or the doer, can have. So the doer can have a lot of cognitive biases, and it acts differently than the thinker. And the way that they can demonstrate that these two different systems exist is that they can give undergraduate students in their laboratories a set of questions to answer. And they're multiple choice answers. And they find that the thinker will choose one answer, the doer will choose a different answer. So that's how you know whether it's the thinker or doer. And in general, the thinker comes up with the correct answer, the doer comes up with an incorrect answer, and that's how you can tell that it was the doer that did it. There was also a book from 2002 about Blink, the Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And in that book, Malcolm Gladwell extols the virtue of system one, or the doer's decisions. There are some times when that doer comes up with an intuitive idea of how something is in the world, and you can't logically justify it right on the spot there. But if you go and you do a whole bunch of research, you can say, yes, that was a correct model. And I think that's how a lot of scientific breakthroughs come from, that kind of intuitive thinking coming from system one. So I'm going to give you an example of the kind of test that they would give to demonstrate these two processes. So here's the description. I'm going to let you read the description. And then after this description, they would give you 8 different descriptions of Linda, and they would want you to rank them from most probable to least probable. Now, 5 of those 8 items on that list they didn't care about at all. There were really only 3 items that they cared about, so I'm only going to give you the 3 items that they cared about. And those 3 items are here. And the idea is to rank these 3 items from most probable to least probable. And I'm actually going to do the experiment right here in the room. And what I'm going to do, when I say the word go, raise either your right hand, your left hand, or both hands, depending on which one of these 3 descriptions you think matches that description. Ready, set, go. Wow, a lot of thinkers in this room. Okay, well, there was nobody in this room that gave the answer 3. And you were all correct. The correct statement is either 1 or 2, and it doesn't matter which one of those you chose. But the great majority of people that are given this test, I think it's because they had 8 other items mixed in with it, sprinkled between these 3, so it wasn't quite as obvious. But the majority of people that takes this test answer 3, which is the wrong answer. And like I said, there was a answer key, and this is the answer key. The thinker would answer 1 or 2, and the doer would answer 3. Now, the way the thinker figures this out is by thinking about a Venn diagram or something equivalent to that. Obviously, there are fewer feminist bank tellers than there are bank tellers, or there are feminists, so that has to be the least probable action. However, the doer answers a different question. It answers the question, which statement matches more of the categories mentioned in the description? The other way of thinking about that is it's taking this word and here and turning it into an or. If you make that an or, then 3 is the answer to this question instead of 1 or 2. So the doer is answering a different question because it doesn't understand probability. That's one of the things that Daniel Kahneman found. It doesn't understand the concept of probability. The thinker understands the concept of probability. So when they tested this exact example with all 8 options on a group of Stanford Business School graduates, 85% of them gave the wrong answer. So they were using their doer to answer that question, even though they're trained in probability, decision-making, and statistics. They didn't come up with the right answer. In a review of this experiment, Stephen Jay Gould wrote, "I'm particularly fond of this example because I know that the third statement is least probable, yet a little homunculus in my head continues to jump up and down, shouting at me, 'But she can't just be a bank teller, read the description.'" So I think that's a great description of the doer. The doer's, he's really sure of his answer and tries to convince the thinker that he's wrong. So there was a conference in 2006 about the dual process theory, and then a book was written from that conference in 2009. And I'm going to give a quote from that book. The quote goes, "It would be more useful to describe the grand unifying form of dual process theory as the two minds hypothesis. Here I define mind as a high-level cognitive system capable of representing the external world and acting upon it in order to serve the goals of the organism." So notice here that he is talking exactly about an agent. It has goals, it can change the external world, and it has the representation of the world as required by the good regulator theorem. So this is exactly an agent. This quote goes on and says, "This two-mind hypothesis is that the human brain contains not one but two parallel systems for doing this. Animals, according to this view, have only one system corresponding to the old mind in human beings, whereas humans have a new mind which coexists in uneasy coalition with the first, sometimes coming into direct conflict with it. So the old mind is the doer and the new mind is the thinker." And then he says, "This is a strong, even startling hypothesis, which makes it very interesting, if probably wrong." So I hope that my presentation will make that more likely to be true. I hope that you'll decide that this is more likely true than probably wrong. So now I'm going to talk about self-models. First of all, remember that an agent needs a self-model if they change the world and if they are part of the world. Then they need to have a self-model to account for their presence in the world. So on that basis, the thinker definitely has a self-model, and it's a very complicated self-model. It includes the autobiographical narrative history of me, all of the goals of the thinker made up, like I must always be right, and a simplified body model, and the thinker thinks that he controls that body completely. He doesn't, but he thinks he does. The doer self-model is much simpler. It's the full body model, including all the current state of the body and knowing all of its capabilities and limitations. And then it has the goals that are built into the doer, and those include things like attachments and aversions. Attachment is something that you want to get, and aversion is something you want to stay away from. And those are indicated, the attachments and aversions are indicated by emotions and feelings. Now, the experiencer has two self-models that are equivalent, but the first thing is the experiencer doesn't change the external world. So maybe it doesn't need to have a self-model because it doesn't change the external world. Well, the experiencer does direct both top-down and bottom-up attention, and that changes the internal representation of the world. Whenever you're making your attention go to a certain object, you're basically amplifying the signal from that object, and it's broadcast to the thinker and doer so they can act on that object. So every time you move your attention around in this room, you are actually changing the representation of the world that you have in your head. So paying attention does modify the internal world model, so it does need a self-model for that reason. And therefore, the attention state of that experiencer must be part of the world model, because otherwise the world would be changing when nothing was really changing. It's just attention that was changing. So in a sense, the experiencer is the current state of attention combined with the current state of the world model. So in other words, the first experiential self-model is that self-model is identical to the world model. Now, if the experiencer doesn't have a separate self-model, if all it has is a world model, the other thing you could say would be that there is no self-model because all it has is a world model. There isn't a separate self-model that you can identify. So there's also this sense in which you could say the experiencer has no self-model. Now I'm going to talk about the approximate locations of the brain. And the approximate locations is that the frontal lobes contain the thinker and the doer, and the back three lobes of the brain contain the experiencer. So the experiencer is about 60% of the brain. The thinker and doer share about 40% of the brain. Now, the other thing to remember about our frontal lobes is that our frontal lobes are bigger than the great ape relatives that we have. So that's where I think the thinker became more powerful. The frontal lobes expanded. Now, I'm now going to display a diagram of the connections between the three agents. So you start with the human brain and add the three agents. You have the thinker and you have the doer, which has feelings and emotions. And then the experiencer has the model of the world, but there are two parts to that model of the world. There's the sensory model of the world, and then there's the language model of the world. And those aren't two separate models. There's actually a continuous hierarchy of categories that go from the raw sense state up to here. For example, you could have, I'll step up from the raw impressions here, is that you could have a line detector that detects that there's a line. In fact, this is the way the visual system works in the brain. You can have an area, a part of the system that detects areas, that detects objects, and then detects connections between objects, all the way up to finally the language description of the objects that you're talking about here. The other thing is, notice that I say representation and model. In general, I'm just going to say model, but the representation refers to the current state of the world. Model is referring to the way that you can predict the future state of the world based on that current state. It's actually based on the history of the world up to here, plus the current state, allows the experiencer to predict the future states of the world. And that also includes the future states of the body, and it also has the models of the self. The thinker and doer self models are contained within the experiencer. So to this, we add the inputs to the brain. And the most important one I want to talk about here is the spoken and written language input. The way that we get our language representation of the world is that we're taught it in school. So we have like 20 plus years where we are being educated by our parents and then by our teachers and mentors and our work, so it's more than 20 years that goes into building up our model of the world, and it's been dumped in there by all of the concepts that were taught by other people. And then the output, again, there's the spoken and written language output. So language output here is a way of transferring your model of the world to somebody else. That's how models of the world get transferred, and that's how we got such a very complete language model of the world. And that's why we didn't immediately have all these modern behaviors back 200,000 years ago when we had a modern brain. It took a while for that language representation to be built up and passed down from generation to generation. Then we got to connect up the different agents in the brain, and I'll mention the global workspace here. Those are a set of nodes that have been identified by neuroscientists that connect the back of the brain to the front of the brain when we have a conscious experience. So a conscious experience means that the thinker is aware of it. And remember that the thinker is the conscious agent in dual process theory. The doer is subconscious. So when we are aware of something in the world, it's the thinker that's aware of it, and this global workspace has to be activated, which is connecting the experiencer model of the world to the thinker. The doer will have a faster interface. So this is the connections between the models there. There are also connections where the thinker can produce thoughtful speech, which is what we speak out when we're thinking about what we're going to say, or we can have automatic speech, which comes from the doer, and that's just the doer kind of doing a dump of the language model of the world and going out through language. So there are two different kinds of of speech, either thoughtful speech or automatic speech. And then besides producing thoughtful speech, the thinker also produces the inner voice, which the experiencer hears. And it's essentially hearing that as if it was somebody else talking to it. Instead of coming through the ears, it's coming through the neurons from the frontal lobes. And after that, there's a very important interface, which is the attention interface. Both the thinker and the doer can tell the experiencer to pay attention to something. So if you're trying to do something with an object, you're going to ask the thinker is going to ask the experiencer to pay attention to that, to amplify that so I can see what's going on. And then there's bottom-up attention, which is where the experiencer notices something in the environment that it thinks are important for the thinker and doer. So it'll notify them, hey, this object is here. Like there's a snake that I didn't expect before. So the experience will use bottom-up attention to tell you that there's a snake. So when you're learning to play piano for the first time, your thinker is trying to tell the experiencer to pay attention to the notes on the page. The notes go up to the thinker, then he communicates down to the doer, press this key on the keyboard, and the doer presses it, and you don't get a very melodious music. After a long time of practicing, months or in my case years, you start to take the thinker out of that loop there, and it goes directly from the experiencer through the doer. Now the doer is telling a top-down attention to pay attention to the notes, and then the doer just knows how to press the keyboards. That's when you get a virtuoso playing piano. One other thing that the doer has to do is it has to tell the thinker about any motor plans, that any planned movement of the body, because that's going to change the expected sensory input of the experiencer. Okay, a final thing is that intuition, my definition of intuition is an understanding of how the world works without thinking. That means that intuition comes from the experiencer because it knows how the world works. Now, instinct is knowing what to do in the world without thinking. That comes from the doer. So instincts are in the doer, intuition is in the experiencer. So now for an animal, let's look at the same diagram. First of all, the animal has a weaker thinker, and besides possibly having just a smaller frontal lobe that doesn't have as powerful a thinker, it also doesn't have the extensive world model built-in language. In fact, the only conceptual models that the animal will have will be the concepts that it came up from its own experience in the world. So it has a very limited conceptual model of the world. It doesn't have language input that allows it to do that. Now, animals do have signaling and communication, but that's not transferring a language model of the world from one animal to another animal. It's just, like an on-off signal. It's like a 1-bit signal, that kind of a thing. So the other thing is that the animals don't have a thoughtful speech output. And that can be demonstrated with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees will emit a cry if they find a tree that has a lot of ripe fruit on it. And this will attract the whole troop to that tree so that they can all share in the abundance there. So Jane Goodall did an experiment once where she took a bunch of bananas and hid them, and then she watched. And one of the chimpanzees came over and found it, and he started to emit that cry, but he put his hand over his mouth right away to stop him from emitting the cry. So that chimpanzee's thinker solved the problem of how do I keep all these bananas for myself? But he couldn't do it by actually suppressing the cry. He had to do it by putting his hand on his mouth. So that shows that he did solve the problem, but he couldn't do it with thoughtful speech. Now, if they don't have thoughtful speech, they probably don't have inner speech, but we can't ask them to find out if that's true or not. So this is the animal model. Now, since we have 3 different agents, are there 3 different kinds of consciousness? The thinker consciousness, and remember, we have to include the experiencer because it has the model of the world that the thinker uses. I'm going to call the thinker consciousness the language consciousness. And that's because it's mostly using the language concepts to do its thinking. Then there's the doer consciousness, which I'm calling the primary consciousness. And the reason I say primary is that it's using the primary sensory inputs to build this consciousness for this agent. And it's also the kind of consciousness that we share with the animals. So the animals had that primary consciousness, and we still have that, but we've added on top of that the language consciousness. Finally, there's the experiencer consciousness, which I'm going to call the fundamental consciousness. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So going back to the diagram, the language consciousness is those 2 agents. The primary consciousness is those 2 agents. And then the animal primary consciousness, again, the same 2 agents. And the fundamental consciousness is the experiencer all by itself. Now, my claim is that fundamental consciousness is an enlightened state of consciousness. So the spiritual traditions that talk about enlightened states are basically talking about fundamental consciousness. For example, in the Hindu Advaita Vedanta, enlightenment is said to be non-dual. Now, non-duality means not 2, 1, and it's seen that the self and other distinction is an illusion, that there isn't really a difference between self and other. The other way of saying that is that the world and I are one, because there isn't any difference between me and the world. Now, the first experiencer self model is that the self model equals the entire world model. That fits right into the statement here. So fundamental consciousness is non-dual. It doesn't have a representation of me that's separate from the world. I'm just part of I am the world. In the Buddhist tradition, anatta is the realization of no self, that any experience of self of any kind is an illusion. Now, the second experiencer self model is that there is no self model. That says that anatta is realized in fundamental consciousness. So fundamental consciousness is an enlightened state of consciousness. Now I've got a comparison of the differences between the primary and language consciousness, and I will be skipping most of these except to concentrate on the last one, which is that the primary consciousness does most of the work of living life, but the language consciousness takes most of the credit. It thinks it did everything, but it was really the primary consciousness that did most of it. So what's the problem that spirituality and spiritual enlightenment solve? The problem is the thinker. Not that thinker, it's the thinker agent, which is also known as the ego. Now, the thinker is ideal for developing civilization and science and technology and helps us achieve a lot of goals, but it's not good at living a happy life. The thinker finds problems everywhere because, after all, it's the problem solver. So what's it going to work on? It's going to work on a problem. So what it's got to do is find a problem. This can lead to a negative critical attitude towards life because everything's a problem. And if there is no problem, then that's a problem. What am I going to do? There's no problem. So it'll look for an old problem that it can work on, or it'll invent a new problem. It'll find a way of creating a new problem. And the thinker argues with reality. this should not happen, or this is bad and wrong, or I should not have done that. This leads to an experiential model of the world that's filled with contradictions, because the sensory experience says this did happen, whereas the language model now has the thinker's inner voice saying this should not have happened. So negative emotions are a problem. How do I prevent this from happening again? Positive emotions are a problem. How do I make sure this happens all the time? So any kind of emotion of any kind is a problem for the thinker. And then problems can be in the past. That's usually called a resentment, if you're trying to solve a problem in the past. And problems can be in the future, and that usually triggers fears. Finally, the thinker is an emotion amplifier and an emotion echo chamber. It keeps these negative emotions going over and over and over a long period of time. Now, Buddhism says that the cause of suffering is attachments and aversions, and the thinker also amplifies and echoes attachments and aversions. So, what's the purpose of spirituality? Well, the problem is that the typical non-spiritual modern human completely identifies as the thinker self model. That's who I am. You know, I am the autobiographical self model. I am in complete control of the body. That's what the thinker thinks, and that's what the modern human thinks he is. He thinks he's that. So the goal of spirituality is to undo the problems that this thinker identification creates. So the first step is to try to reduce identification with the thinker, then to diminish the thinker's selfishness and self-centeredness, and to reduce the thinker's judgments and criticisms. And theistic spiritual traditions will ask the thinker to surrender to a higher power. So first let's look at non-theistic spiritual traditions. They try to undo the suffering caused by the thinker. And these paths arose when the thinker first became conscious, where at that time the apparent increase in suffering caused by the thinker would have been more apparent because they would have seen what it was like before, and now it's different than what it was like before. And as I said, enlightened states are where the thinker's suffering can be completely eliminated by eliminating the thinker and being just in the fundamental consciousness. So in that state, there is no identification with the thinker. Now, continuing with the theistic spiritual traditions, I'm going to ask, what is God in this model? And God started when the language consciousness first became conscious, when the universal representation system was able to represent the entire world. At that time, a weaker thinker could have experienced the stronger agent, the doer or experiencer, with more power in the world. Thus, the doer or experiencer could be identified as God. Now, the experiencer is actually the best candidate for God, and that's because the experiencer creates the world that we live in. So, in a sense, God created the world. It's absolutely true. Intuition comes from the experiencer, and it's often said that when you're saying a prayer asking for help, an intuitive thought will come to you, and that comes from God. It's coming from the experiencer. And I'm going to talk about this wise intuitive modifications of the intention mechanism in the next few slides here. So this can give the experiencer quite a bit of power in the world. I'm going to talk about alcohol addiction, and since I'm running out of time, I'll go through this pretty quickly. The thinker starts the alcohol addiction. I really like alcohol. This creates a goal to drink alcohol. And then repeating that goal over and over again, drinking alcohol frequently causes the doer to have a goal to drink alcohol also. So the doer learns by repetition. Eventually, both agents become addicted to alcohol. The doer gets triggered. If somebody puts a drink in front of the doer, he'll pick up and drink it before you even think about it. So that's the doer part of the addiction. And the thinker will obsess about alcohol, thinking about it, boy, I'd be a lot happier if I was drinking right now. And it uses top-down attention to get alcohol. And eventually the thinker notices the negative consequences of its drinking, and it wants to stop, but it's too late. Both agents are addicted at this point. And notice that this addiction is using both top-down and bottom-up attention on alcohol to keep the addiction process going. Now, there's a spiritual tradition called Alcoholics Anonymous, which has a solution for alcoholism. And it has a 12-step program. The first step is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives were unmanageable. And the translation of that is that the thinker wants to quit drinking, but it admits that it's powerless over the alcohol and can't manage its own life. So I'm just going to read the translations for these other steps here. Step 2 is the thinker sees that the experiencer could help with the addiction. And step 3 is where the thinker surrenders to the experiencer. It goes on from there with steps 4 through 12 taking inventories and making amends, and using prayer and meditation to increase their conscious contact with God. Now, the normal experiencer attention mechanism is this. The experiencer knows about the goals of both the thinker and doer since its self-model is part of the experiencer. So the experiencer will use bottom-up attention to inform the thinker or doer if any of their goal conditions are detected. And the experiencer also directs top-down attention as requested by the agents. And it also pays attention to the thinker's inner voice and the doer's emotions. So those get amplified by the experiencer when it pays attention to that inner voice coming through. This attention essentially amplifies the inner voice or the emotion because the experiencer is paying attention to it. In the active alcoholic, the thinker's inner voice is obsessing about drinking. That gets amplified and reinforced by the experiencer paying attention to it. So it treats the obsession as a top-down attention request, and the bottom-up attention can also find alcohol and cause it to drink. Now, the wise, intuitive attention control mechanism that I talked about earlier is where the experiencer notices that the thinker admits it is defeated by alcohol and it wants the experiencer's help to stop drinking. The wise intuitive wisdom is that the experiencer understands that if it directed less attention to alcohol, it could help the thinker and doer avoid drinking. So the experiencer goes ahead and directs less attention to alcohol. That helps diminish the obsessive alcoholic thoughts because it's not being amplified by the experiencer anymore when it hears the thinker obsessing about alcohol. And the same mechanism would work also for attachments and aversions. In Buddhism, they talk about letting go of all attachments and aversions in the enlightened state. And this same mechanism of the wise intuitive attention control could help eliminate the attachments and aversions. And finally, people in enlightened states report less emotions and less inner voice going on, especially self-referential inner voice. And this mechanism can also help with that, explain that fact. And this happens in the experiencer whenever it has these kinds of goal requests. I've got a slide here talking about some Bible passages that you'll have to read later at your leisure. And let me talk about meditation and how it helps solve the thinker problem. And I've got less than 1 minute left here, so I'm going to go quickly. Concentrating on breathing helps because both the thinker and doer control breathing. Mantras or chants can help because you're keeping the thinker busy repeating the mantra or chant. Focused top-down attention can help because the thinker is trying to direct attention instead of creating inner voice thoughts. Open monitoring attention can help because you're paying attention to the experiencer in open monitoring attention mechanisms. And this all makes it easier to notice the doer and experiencer agents and thus to reduce identification with the thinker. Some other spiritual practices is surrender is the thinker giving up the illusion of control, and it's just an illusion of control. He doesn't really have control. And the thinker uses prayer to ask for help from the doer or experiencer. Living in the now is what the experiencer does. Forgiveness and acceptance can mitigate resentments. And my favorite saying is from Jack Kornfield that forgiveness is about giving up all hope of a better past. And Krishnamurti was asked, what's the secret? And he said, I don't mind what happens. That's exactly what the experiencer does. It doesn't mind what happens. It accepts the world in exactly as it is. Doesn't make any judgments about it. This shouldn't happen, this should happen. That's exactly what the experiencer does. Trusting a higher power can mitigate fear caused by the thinker trying to solve problems in the future. And gratitude is an antidote for the thinker's many complaints. So thank you for directing your top-down attention to my presentation. And I hope that your experiencer intuitively understand the three-agent model of consciousness and that this model has explained the origin, purpose, and efficacy of spirituality. And I think I have 0 time for questions, but maybe you can ask 1 or 2 quickly. Thanks.